the very unusual electoral system we have in Ireland, and that generates a big puzzle. What do people vote for? Do they vote for candidates or parties? The discussion in Ireland tends to be that candidates are very important, but we've had a relatively stable party system for the history of the state. So if people are voting for candidates, it seems odd that they typically give candidates from the same parties roughly equal support. That's what the ballot paper looks like. The one on the left is a ballot paper. The one on the right is a blown up part of the top of the paper on the left. And each contains a logo telling you which party they're in, if they're in a party at all. The ones that are blank have no party. The name of the candidate and where they live, which is important. A picture of them, which may or may not be important. And a little space on the right-hand side. And the space on the right-hand side is for the voter. That's where you write a number. And what the voter is asked to do is to number those candidates in order of preference. At the very least, they have to write a 1 next to a candidate's name. But they may go on and put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, ranking all the candidates on offer. You will notice that candidates from the same party are not next to one another. All candidates are on the same ballot paper, listed only in alphabetical order. So if you want to vote for all three Labour Party people, there, and there, you've got to find them. Or the two Fianna Fáil people, there and there. You've got to scroll through the ballot paper to find those two before you vote for anybody else. So, as it says on this slide, this is what you do. You rank them, you write 1 next to at least one of them. There is a quota then to be elected. And that's fairly simple. Typically there are 3, 4, or 5 seats in each constituency. But just to make it easy, let's assume there's only 1 seat. The quota would be half of the votes cast plus 1. 1 plus votes cast divided by 2. That's the quota. I think it's called the Droop quota, and it's used in lots of electoral systems. And that's the number of votes you need in order to win. If no candidate reaches the quota on the first count, so where there's only 1 seat, if you don't get half the votes first time out, then they take the candidate who finishes bottom and they reallocate that support according to the number 2s on their ballot papers. So if there were only 3 candidates and nobody got a majority on the first count, you eliminate the third and see who the voters who supported that candidate would prefer from the other 2 candidates. And that gives you the decision. It's called the alternative vote when you really only have it in one one-seater district, and that's how we elect the president, that's how we elect by-elections. But in general elections, there are 3, 4, or 5 seats to be filled. So that's essentially how it works. Now the puzzle is, what do people do when they vote? Do they choose candidates or parties? Parties campaign as parties, but candidates put huge efforts in their areas. And the aspect of internal democracy clearly is that even if you're going to vote for a party, you get to decide, at least for some parties, which candidate you prefer. Now, successful big parties will put up 2 or 3 candidates in each constituency. The smaller parties will only nominate 1 because you don't want to waste your vote. And there's a fear that if you put up too many candidates, support will dribble away between them and will not get amalgamated. The same electoral system as used in Malta works rather differently. They nominate huge numbers but people stay very firmly within party lines, and that's not a problem. But the structure of the ballot paper is different in Malta. Each party has a separate column, so it's easy to find them. Now, it looks like people vote for parties because sometimes it's very clear. When our governing party lost more than half of its support, dropping from 40% to 17% in 2011, that was clearly not down to the candidates. It's just that people lost faith in the party. People lost faith in the party, so many of the candidates actually in their posters had the party name in increasingly small letters in the bottom left-hand corner, because they didn't really want to be identified with the party. So sometimes we see very clear signs of party swings. But at the same time, some candidates within a party do better than others, and some candidates can resist swings against a party. Now, how would we know what people are voting for when they vote? We can see from the counting evidence, and we get the aggregate figures from each count. We can see what happens to votes for a particular candidate when that candidate is eliminated or when they're elected with a surplus of votes. And we can see that, in general, the majority of the votes go to a candidate from the same party, which suggests that party is important to people. But even if only a majority do, clearly many don't. So people do vote for a candidate from party A, but don't vote necessarily for the next candidate from that party, which suggests that party is not uppermost in their mind. That's a graph from looking at this evidence from 1948 to 2011, and 2016 would not change it very much. And it's for the two largest parties, Fianna Fáil, FF, and Fine Gael, FG. And those are the two lines at the top. And they drop from what's called a solidarity, that is where people, where people appear to be voting on party lines, around 80% in the early 1950s, which stayed in the high 70s until the 1980s, and has now dropped to something closer to around 60% or just above. That's a big drop. So if somebody votes for a candidate from Fianna Fáil, let's say, traditionally the largest party, there's only about a 60% chance that they'll vote for the next candidate from the same party as a second preference. The little graph there underneath just shows survey data on party attachment. And it used to be about 60% in the 1980s. It's now down to just over 20%. So party attachment is much lower, and though that's dropped much faster, and we see that this solidarity of voting seems to have declined. But many people, most people, don't only vote for candidates of one party. There was a tendency to do so in the past, but perhaps with many more parties now, and more parties just nominating one candidate, it's far less common than it used to be, even amongst the larger parties. More than half the voters who vote for any party do vote for a candidate from another party at some point. In election studies, we used mock ballots. So we gave people a copy of what looked like the ballot paper. It wasn't in colour and it didn't have candidates' pictures on, but more or less the ballot paper, and said, could you fill that in as you filled it in at election time, to give us some understanding of how people fill in the ballot paper. And this is evidence that can be checked against some hard evidence from some electronic voting also in 2002, and gives fairly similar results. Now, what proportion of people vote for all the candidates of their first preference party in sequence? That's very much party voting. So if you were voting for a Fianna Fáil candidate and they nominated 3 candidates, and your first 3 preferences, 1, 2, and 3, all went for Fianna Fáil candidates, that would look like party voting. Only half of Fianna Fáil voters and only 38% of Fine Gael voters voted like that. So it happens, but it's not that common. Most do vote for all the candidates of their favourite party, but not necessarily in sequence. Often there's a break there somewhere. Another way is to ask people directly how they voted, what they voted for. It's always very difficult to ask people your research question because you might not, the answer might not mean what you think it means. So we asked 2 questions. What was most important to you? Was it the party or the candidate? And then we asked a second question. Would you still have voted for that candidate if they'd been running for a different party? And I cross-tabulate the answers. And there are some who say the candidate was most important and they would have followed that candidate to another party. On average, around 30%. 2011 was a funny election when parties were more important, and it's gone up again at the last election. Party was most important, and no, if that candidate had stood for another party, I would not have voted for them. Those are party voters. So somewhere around 30% are candidate voters, just under 30% say they're party voters, and the rest are mixed. They voted maybe for a candidate, but they wouldn't have followed that candidate to another party, or it would depend, or some kind of inconsistent answer. But that suggests that candidates are important and parties are important, and it's all rather confusing. There's an indirect way of asking the same question, which we tried to do. We asked people to rate each candidate. So we gave them a list of candidates and said, on a scale of 1 to 10 or on a scale of 0 to 100, how much do you like that candidate? And this is a rather more indirect way. And we can explore those party ratings in all sorts of ways. You can put them in regression equations. You can estimate from regression equations what would happen if everybody treated each candidate equally or liked each candidate equally. But another way I looked at it was to say, well, let's assume we can look at those ratings and we can extract from those ratings which party people feel is the best party and which candidate people feel is the best candidate from the ratings. Now, sometimes the best candidate, or for any candidate, they're not the best candidate, and they don't come from the best party. So you wouldn't expect someone to vote for them. And in fact, in general, only about 5% vote for a candidate who's not the best candidate, who's not from the best party. That's dropping off the bottom a bit. Whoops. A candidate who is the best candidate and from the best party, you'd expect them to get heavy support. In fact, many people do vote for such candidate. But the interesting ones are here. The best candidate who's not from the best party as opposed to a candidate who's from the best party but is not the best candidate. And what's important there is the candidate, 23%, seems more important than party. Most people, or most are in this area here. But that contrast is an interesting one. Looked at in a different way, when both are best, and there are ties here, which sometimes there's more than one that's best, and more than one party. Again, the contrast is here. Best party but not best candidate, not many people vote that way. But best candidate but not best party attracts huge support. Conclusion. For most voters, party and candidate assessments are intertwined. Parties work very hard to get good candidates. They'll often pick candidates who are associated with former successful candidates, in particular sons and daughters of former candidates, enable party to combine a sort of personal element, the candidate element, and the party element. Voters like to say that candidate's important because they do like the candidate to work for the local area. But there's no doubt that when they view a candidate, they do view them through a party prism. And it's a bit like the interaction between party leaders and parties. Your favorite party usually has the best leader because they're the leader of your favorite party. But the growing success of non-party candidates in Irish elections does suggest that candidate factors may be growing as party declines. But our assessments of how important is one relative to the other will depend on how we measure that and how we do the analysis. Measurement ultimately in these things is critical. Thank you.